Hi everyone, today I'm covering the new RG353V from Anbernic. The 353V is an interesting release as there's actually two model variants, the RG353V and the RG353VS. The main difference between the two is the 353V dual boots between Android and Linux, and so has an extra gig of RAM and a touchscreen to help navigate around Android. From a performance perspective, in Linux, I doubt I'd be able to actually tell the difference between the two. So my advice would be, if you're not bothered about the Android side and know you'll spend all of your time within Linux anyway, go with the VS. But if you love a bit of Android or really like to performance tinker, then go with the V. I picked up the V, so I'll be able to check out both operating systems, but there is a little cost saving between the two. Speaking of which, I actually think the RG353V and VS are both quite competitively priced and offer quite a lot of bang for the buck alongside the decent build quality Anbernic's known for. Speaking of which, straight out of the box, the RG353V will feel familiar to anyone who's previously held an Anbernic handheld before and is well built throughout. From top down, we've got a USB-C port, micro HDMI out and a headphone jack, as well as the 4 shoulder buttons around the top half of the back. On the right side, we've got the power and reset buttons, which are both neatly set in the case so they're not easily accidentally pressed, as well as 2 micro SD slots. On the left side, we've got volume buttons, and underneath, we've got another USB-C port, which is used for charging. Overall, it's a pretty neat layout for a vertical handheld, and for me personally, made sense an upgrade option over the RG351V, which I've previously featured. So jumping straight into the controls, this vertical layout takes a little getting used to, especially if you're used to landscape handhelds, but I grew to like it pretty quickly. For me, it all comes down to when you'll need access to the joystick positions alongside the shoulder buttons. I personally wouldn't want to use the RG353V as a streaming handheld, for example, as playing modern day dual stick shooters is just not what this control scheme is ever going to do well. But I actually found it really quite neat for the Nintendo 64 games, especially Zelda's. Where you use the right analog stick for the C buttons on the Nintendo 64 controller as almost quick links, it just suits this layout really well, and I found myself really naturally adapting and liking playing Ocarina of Time with it, with only a little adjustment period. Where the RG353V's controls are at their best with, however, are the front-facing buttons and D-pad. You have a well-sized space as well as responsive ABXY buttons, as well as a very good D-pad, essentially exactly what Anbernic do best. I had zero problems when using the shoulder buttons in conjunction with the D-pad when gripping the handheld in a way that is D-pad focused, and this just feels like the more natural grip while gaming on it. The front-facing function key is essentially the RetroArch key button in their Linux firmware, and this is certainly favoured over having it mapped to L3 or R3 buttons on the joysticks, as the function key just feels a lot more natural to me. So just before moving on to looking at the firmware, I thought I'd just do a quick size comparison, comparing first against Anbernic's RG353P. The 353P is essentially the horizontal version of the 353V, the level of emulation ability being between the two essentially being equal. So you'll not be able to be in a position where you'll be able to emulate one system on one and not on the other, for example. Also, thanks to very similar internals, the custom firmware available on the 353P is available on the V, which is really great to see. Next up, we have the Mayu Mini, which is probably one of, if not the most played of my vertical handheld. And although the 353V is obviously the bigger option between the two, I think it's a nice example to show that the 353V is certainly portable and make a good travel companion without the worry of it taking up a load of room with you. So moving on to the firmware side of things, the 353V, like the P before it, dual boots between Linux and Android. Jumping into the Linux build first, it's actually a very familiar take on Emulation Station, but the last build date was the end of September, and it does seem like a pretty decent build. Everything's set up just to work out of the box with no real tweaking required. The dedicated function key is used very effectively, and a lot of the quick keys and controls make complete sense and can be learned very quickly. We've also got a custom build of Android 11, which has no Google Play Store. Luckily, the RG353V comes pre-installed with pretty much every app you'd want anyway, and you can always sideload anything you're specifically looking for. The Anbernic Android front end I featured on a previous video is also pre-installed and works really well up to Nintendo 64 and above anyway, where you'll get better emulation from using the relevant standalone emulator over the Android front end that loads everything up via RetroArch at this stage. I'm actually a massive fan of Anbernic's Android front end, although it'd be great to see some further customizations like being able to choose which emulators are used and hiding things like the RetroArch overlay. Overall though, I'm glad it's there and do find it very easy to use. Okay, so I'll leave you to some gameplay now and then summarise back up at the end. So overall, I'm pretty impressed with Anbernic's RG353V. It's a great vertical handheld that has a lot going for it. If your preference are vertical handhelds over landscape ones, the RG353V or VS are both going to be great options to you. I personally am happy with it as an upgrade from the RG351V, and although both PS2 and GameCube are realistically going to be out of its emulation scope, and I personally wouldn't use it as a streaming handheld due to the joystick positions, this form factor and vertical layout do suit what it can emulate very well. So that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching.